Ian Keatley has spent his entire career in rugby. Private school in Cork, professional contracts with Munster and Italy's Benetton, caps for Ireland. He represents everything traditional about Irish sport: discipline, team ethic, amateur values preserved in a professional era, and the unspoken assumption that rugby is a proper sport, while combat sports are something lesser. Until November 2024, when he sat across from Conor McGregor on RTE's Saturday Night Show and suggested that MMA wasn't really a sport at all, but rather organised violence with a referee. What Conor said in response, calmly and devastatingly, made Ian Keatley sit in complete silence for 19 seconds before attempting a defence that everyone watching knew came from a place of class prejudice, not sporting knowledge. This is the story of how a fighter from Crumlin made a rugby player from Cork realise that intelligence, discipline and character aren't determined by which sport you play or which school you attended. To understand why this interview became one of the most discussed moments in Irish sports media, you need to know the context. Irish rugby and Irish MMA exist in completely different worlds. Rugby is middle class, rooted in private schools like Blackrock College and Presentation Brothers College, played at clubs with waiting lists and membership fees. It's the sport of doctors' sons and solicitors' daughters. MMA is working class, rooted in council estates and community gyms, accessible to anyone willing to train. It's the sport of kids who couldn't afford rugby club fees. The two sports rarely intersect, and when they do, there's an unspoken hierarchy. Rugby players are athletes, MMA fighters are brawlers. Ian Keatley, 37 years old, embodied that assumption perfectly. Educated at Presentation Brothers College in Cork, he'd grown up in a world where rugby was culture, where the Six Nations was religion, where sportsman meant team player, not individual competitor. He'd never trained in MMA, never spoken to a professional fighter, but he had opinions, strong ones. In a podcast 2 weeks before the RTE appearance, he'd said, "I respect what McGregor's done commercially, but calling MMA a sport is generous. It's closer to entertainment. Real sports require strategy, teamwork, years of technical development. MMA is two people hitting each other until one can't continue. That's not sport, that's violence with rules." The comments went viral in Ireland, specifically among the MMA community, who were tired of being dismissed by rugby players who'd never stepped inside an octagon. Conor McGregor saw the clip, smiled, and when RTE invited both men onto the Saturday Night Show for a friendly discussion about Irish sporting culture, he accepted immediately. Ian Keatley, confident in his position and unaware of what was coming, accepted too. The RTE studio was set up for conversation, not confrontation. 2 comfortable chairs, a small table between them with water, warm lighting. The host, Brendan O'Connor, sat slightly to the side, ready to facilitate. Ian Keatley arrived first, wearing dark jeans, a Munster rugby polo and a blazer, the uniform of the professional rugby player off duty. Clean-cut, well-groomed, the look of someone who'd never been in a street fight in his life. Conor arrived minutes later, 3-piece navy suit, no tie, pocket square. The visual contrast was immediate. Keatley looked like a private school prefect. Conor looked like he owned the building. Brendan opened carefully. "Gentlemen, you represent 2 very different Irish sporting traditions. Ian, you've been quite vocal about your thoughts on MMA. Do you want to explain your position?" Keatley nodded, his Cork accent polished and articulate. "Look, I have massive respect for what Conor's achieved commercially. He's built a brand, made himself wealthy, put Ireland on the map in certain circles. But I think there's a fundamental difference between what he does and what I'd call a real sport." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. Rugby requires years of technical training. You need to understand phase play, line-out calls, defensive systems. You need to work within a team structure where 11 other players depend on you making the right decision in milliseconds. That's sport. That's athleticism. What Conor does, getting in a cage and fighting until someone can't continue, that's entertainment. It's spectacle. But it's not sport in the traditional sense. The statement was delivered politely, almost apologetically, but the condescension was unmistakable. Conor sat completely still, his expression neutral, listening without interrupting. Keatley continued, warming to his theme. And I think that distinction matters, especially for young Irish people trying to decide what path to follow. Rugby teaches you teamwork, discipline, respect for authority. MMA teaches you to be selfish, to promote yourself, to prioritize individual glory over collective success. Those are different value systems, and I know which one I'd want my kids learning. There was a pause. Conor looked at Keatley with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and pity. Then he spoke, his Dublin accent thick, but his words precisely chosen. Ian, thank you for being honest about how you see MMA, because what you've just described tells me everything I need to know about how little you actually understand about what I do. Keatley's expression flickered, just slightly, uncertainty replacing confidence. Let me start with the not a real sport claim, Conor said. You said rugby requires years of technical training. Let me tell you what I had to master to become a two-division UFC champion. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a martial art that takes 10 to 15 years to reach black belt level, with more technical positions than rugby has plays. Wrestling, Olympic-level grappling that requires understanding leverage, timing, and body mechanics at a level you've never experienced. Boxing, not just throwing punches, but footwork, head movement, distance management, ring generalship. Muay Thai, 8-point striking system using fists, elbows, knees, and shins. And then I had to learn how to combine all of those disciplines seamlessly, transitioning between them mid-fight while someone's trying to knock me unconscious. He paused, letting that sink in. You said I just fight until someone can't continue. Ian, that's like me saying rugby is just running around with a ball until someone scores. It's reductive to the point of ignorance. Every second in that octagon requires split-second decision-making. Do I close distance or maintain range? Do I grapple or strike? Do I defend a takedown or accept guard and work submissions? And I'm making those decisions while exhausted, hurt, and under more pressure than you've ever experienced in your life. Keatley tried to interrupt, but rugby has... I'm not finished, Conor said, firmly but politely. You mentioned teamwork. Let me tell you about my team. I have coaches for every discipline: boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports psychology. I have cutmen, massage therapists, sparring partners who travel internationally to prepare me. I have managers, lawyers, publicists. My selfish individual sport requires coordinating dozens of people's schedules, expertise, and egos. The difference between my team and yours, Ian, is that when I step in that cage, they can't help me. I'm alone, completely. And if I fail, it's not because the fly half missed a kick or the prop got penalized. It's because I wasn't good enough. That's not selfish, that's total accountability.
Conor shifted in his chair and his tone changed slightly, less defensive, more analytical. But I think we're dancing around the real issue here, Ian. This isn't really about sport versus entertainment. This is about class. Keatley's eyes widened slightly. What? You went to Presentation Brothers College, Conor said. Private school in Cork. Fees, rugby program, university pipeline. You grew up in a world where sport was accessible, where you had coaches and facilities and a clear path from school team to provincial academy to professional contract. Rugby was your culture, your community, your identity. And I respect that, I do. He leaned forward. But I grew up in Crumlin, council estate in Dublin. No rugby clubs, no fees for anything, no coaches scouting our estate. If I wanted to do sport, my options were football, which I wasn't good enough at, or fighting. Not MMA, just fighting, scrapping. Because that's what working-class Dublin kids do. We learn to handle ourselves because we have to. Keatley looked uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat. I'm not saying, let me finish, Conor interrupted gently. When I found martial arts, it wasn't at some prestigious academy. It was at a gym in a warehouse, run by a coach who charged whatever we could afford, which was usually nothing. I trained in clothes that were falling apart. I ate one meal a day because that's all I could afford while training full-time. I had no sponsorships, no guaranteed contracts, no safety net, and I built myself into a world champion from that. Not from Presentation Brothers College, Ian, from Crumlin. The studio was completely silent. Brendan O'Connor looked like he wanted to intervene, but couldn't find the right moment. So when you say MMA isn't a real sport, Conor continued, his voice quiet but cutting, what you're really saying is that working-class combat sports aren't as legitimate as middle-class team sports, that sports played in private schools are more valuable than sports learned in council estate gyms. That's not a sporting judgment, Ian, that's class prejudice. Keatley tried to regain ground. I wasn't making it about class, I was making it about the sport itself. Rugby requires strategic thinking, game management. And MMA doesn't? Conor's eyebrow raised. Ian, do you know what my fight IQ is? Do you understand the level of strategic thinking required to fight at championship level? Keatley hesitated. I'm sure it's significant, but let me give you an example. My fight against Jose Aldo. 15 months of preparation. We studied hundreds of hours of his footage. We identified patterns in his footwork, tendencies in his defensive reactions, emotional triggers in his psychology. We built an entire game plan around provoking specific responses and capitalizing on openings that would appear in milliseconds. And when the fight happened, I executed that strategy in 13 seconds. 13 seconds, Ian. That's not luck. That's not just hitting each other. That's preparation, intelligence, and execution at a level you can't comprehend because you've never experienced it. He paused. You mentioned game management. Let me tell you what game management looks like in MMA. It's 5 rounds, 25 minutes, managing energy systems while someone's trying to hurt you. It's adjusting strategy between rounds based on what's working and what's not. It's reading your opponent's fatigue, recognizing when they're setting traps, knowing when to push and when to conserve. And it's doing all of that while your body's screaming, your face is bleeding, and 50,000 people are watching you either succeed or fail in the most public way possible. Keatley had gone quiet. Conor wasn't done. You went to university, Ian. Good for you. I didn't. I was too busy training to feed myself. But don't confuse education with intelligence. Don't assume that because you studied business at UCC and I trained in a warehouse, you're the smart one and I'm the thug. Because I've built businesses worth hundreds of millions. I've negotiated contracts with billion-dollar corporations. I've managed brands, investments, media appearances across 6 continents. That requires intelligence, Ian. A different kind than yours maybe, but intelligence nonetheless.
There was a long pause. Ian Keatley looked down at his hands, clearly processing something uncomfortable. When he looked back up, his expression had changed. The confidence was gone. You're right about the class thing, he said quietly. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. Conor's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that, Ian. I grew up with rugby, Keatley continued, his voice thoughtful now. It was just there, in school, in my community, in my family. And I think I've always assumed that because it was my sport, because it was the sport of people like me, it was somehow more legitimate than other sports. That's unfair. That's exactly what you said, class prejudice. He paused, then looked directly at Conor. I'm sorry.
I spoke about something I don't understand. I dismissed your sport without ever experiencing it, without talking to people who do it, without recognizing that my perspective is shaped by privilege. The apology was genuine, unexpected, and it changed the entire tone of the conversation. Conor nodded slowly. That takes guts to admit on live television, Ian. I respect that. Can I ask you something? Keatley said. Of course. You said you learned to fight because you had to, because of where you grew up. Do you think if you'd grown up differently, you would have done something else? Conor thought for a moment. Probably. If I'd grown up in Cork with parents who could afford rugby club fees and private school, maybe I'd be sitting where you are. But I didn't, so I'm sitting where I am, and I don't regret a second of it, Ian, because fighting taught me things rugby never could have. It taught me that you don't need permission to be great. You don't need the right school or the right background. You just need will, discipline, and the courage to take a punch and keep moving forward. Brendan O'Connor, sensing the shift, gently steered the conversation toward common ground. It sounds like you're both describing different paths to the same values: discipline, hard work, resilience. Keatley nodded. I think you're right, and I think I've been guilty of assuming my path is the only valid one. Conor leaned back. Look, Ian, rugby is a great sport. It teaches teamwork, strategy, physical courage. I'm not here to dismiss that. But MMA is also a great sport. It teaches different things: self-reliance, total accountability, managing fear when there's no one to help you. Both are valid. Both produce incredible athletes. The problem is when we start ranking them based on which social class tends to play them. Keatley smiled slightly. That's fair, and honestly, watching you just now, the way you broke down fight strategy, the way you explained the technical requirements, I realized I had a completely wrong impression of what MMA involves. Most people do, because they've never trained, they've never felt what it's like to grapple with someone who knows what they're doing, or to spar with someone who can actually punch. It looks simple from the outside, two people fighting, but from the inside, it's as complex as any sport on earth. Keatley nodded thoughtfully. Would you be open to showing me? Not to fight, obviously, but to train, to see what it actually involves. Conor grinned. Absolutely. Come to my gym in Dublin. We'll put you through a beginner's session. Nothing crazy, just enough to give you a sense of what it requires. And I promise you, Ian, you'll walk out with a completely different understanding of what MMA athletes do. The exchange was remarkable. What had started as condescension and dismissal had become genuine curiosity and respect.
The interview ended shortly after, but the impact across Irish sports media was significant. Within hours, clips of Keatley's apology and Conor's class analysis were everywhere. Irish sports fans, who'd spent years divided into rugby camps and MMA camps, found themselves confronted with an uncomfortable truth. The sports they valued often reflected the class they came from. The Irish Times ran a piece titled "McGregor and Keatley Expose Irish Sports Class Divide." The Irish Independent, "When the fighter taught the rugby player about respect." RTE Sport received thousands of messages, mostly praising both men, Keatley for his humility in admitting error, Conor for articulating the class dimension without anger. But the most significant outcome came 3 weeks later. Ian Keatley posted a video on Instagram, himself in Conor's Dublin gym, in training gear, working through basic grappling drills with one of Conor's coaches. He looked exhausted, humbled, and genuinely impressed. The caption, "Conor was right. I spoke about something I didn't understand. After 90 minutes training in his gym, I have nothing but respect for MMA athletes. The technical skill, the cardio, the mental toughness required, it's extraordinary. I was wrong to dismiss it. Thanks to Conor and his team for the education." The post received over 2 million likes. Conor commented, "Respect, Ian. That's what real athletes do. Stay humble and keep learning." What happened between Ian Keatley and Conor McGregor on RTE in November 2024 was a microcosm of something larger. Ireland's ongoing struggle with class, with what counts as legitimate achievement, with who gets respect and why. Rugby players from private schools had spent decades looking down on combat sports from council estates, assuming their sport was inherently superior because it was their sport. Ian Keatley, to his credit, had the courage to admit that assumption was wrong, and Conor McGregor, rather than destroying him for it, chose to educate him. That's harder than any knockout, harder than any dominant performance, harder than any viral moment, because it requires seeing your opponent not as an enemy to defeat, but as a person to teach. And sometimes that's what real champions do.